The worldwide flood, a recent creation. Therefore, creationism versus evolution favors creationism when you get to consider the effects of the worldwide flood, or the result of which there's evidence all over the place. It's hard to deny. We're still in K31.htm, K31.htm. Have a little cold there, so I had difficulty reading the first session. We're going to look at an article done by George R. Hill, Dean of College of Mines and Mineral Industries, Chemtech. He relates by short time in the article. He's talking about 6 hours where temperature and pressure, you can get coal formed from wood in just a few hours, and it doesn't happen slowly. Of course, you study the strata, the environment in which the coal is formed, and you would learn that from the trees and from minute details and beautifully preserved fossils, the same kind of picture is seen when we experiment in the formation of oil. Notice the quotation from Sentinel Star down in Orlando, Florida. And we're doing this at Texas A&M, by the way. This was reporting from an experiment in London, we're told. British scientists, it was reported, claimed to have invented a way to turn household garbage into oil suitable for home heating or power plant use. And we're told here that we are doing this in 10 minutes, what it takes nature 150 million years to do. Really? By whose count? Noel McAuliffe of Manchester University's Institute of Science and Technology reports this. Now, the article goes on to say that the oil is comparable in quality to Middle Eastern crude, 10 minutes, but it took nature 150 million years. Of course, nobody sat down and around and watched it happen. Nobody's 150 million years old. And we look at the environment in which we find it. We find beautifully preserved large fossils that demand a rapid burial. And we know when we do, we observe it forming and that it happens rapidly. And what's the most scientific explanation for its formation? Well, billions of years or just a short event. Well, which one is it? A short event is what we observe. That's what science is supposed to be about. Observation, repeatability, falsifiability. Not imposed items on things that we look at and then change to agree with our presuppositions. Perhaps the most common sedimentary feature in rocks in the layers involves what are known as the ripple marks. And in this illustration, which we don't have here, but in the book, we see a picture that he took at down at Junction, Texas. It looks like what you see in the bottom of a stream running over loose sediment. If you had concrete poured, what is basically what you have wished with, which is basically limestone, and then a stream running over the top of it, it might have features like this. And they might be preserved in the limestone or in the concrete if it happens rapidly. But how do you get such ephemeral structures formed if it takes millions and millions of years to form these layers? When you look at the fossils and you look at the rocks, it should be obvious to the people that will think that this has to be a rapid process. I was making a lecture similar to this down at Texas A&M when one of the professors interrupted and said, "We know all of this. We know that the rocks themselves form rapidly, but the time is in between. This is what we are teaching our students." I said, "Well, thank you. I wish that that would be put in the textbooks. However, because the textbooks often leave the impression that it takes many, many years to form the layers, why don't we change that? But you're saying that the rocks themselves form rapidly." Well, of course, we can see this and prove this. The internal evidence in the strata demonstrate that. Well, where do you get this evidence for time then? He said, "Well, that's in between the rocks." I said, "You mean where there is no evidence? In between the rocks, there's nothing." And he just sort of cleared his throat and sat down. Well, that's exactly where the evidence is. Where it isn't, in the cracks in between the rocks. There are, wow, that's the evidence for time, and it's a non-existing evidence. But they got to stick with what they've been doing for so many years. We'll look at great expanses of layers of rocks like we see in the Grand Canyon. And there's a beautiful and great place to study stratigraphy. And it is obviously absolutely devastating to the concept of great age of the Earth. We're looking at a spot headed toward Horseshoe Mesa. And this is red wall limestone. This is the Mojave limestone underneath it. And here, of course, we see the interface. It's just perfectly level for hundreds of miles. Now, the unique thing about this location is that the bottom layer, the Mojave limestone, is Cambrian. That's at the bottom of the geologic column. You step up almost 200 million years to the Mississippian limestone, which is the red wall, and then you skip almost 200 million years as you go from one to the other. Well, the explanation that the evolutionist gives is that there must have been an erosional surface here. There was erosion going on during almost 200 million years, but what does an erosional surface look like? Especially one that was survived erosion for hundreds of millions of years. Why, just 30 or 40 years of erosion can leave huge gullies. But here's a perfectly straight line for hundreds of miles that's supposed to represent 200 million years of erosion. I think that's a little hard to swallow. But that's not the most difficult part of this explanation. There's something much more significant. As we go from the Mojave Cambrian, we see a little layer of a little layer of the red wall, and then some of the Mojave, and then the red wall, and then the Mojave, and then the red wall. We see it interbedded, changing back and forth 6 times. How do you skip 200 million years 6 times? That's absurd. When they are interbedded, they're contemporary. They're laid down at the same time. They have to be if they're interbedded. There's no physical way for it to be otherwise. And yet the evolutionary theory based on the fossils and the rocks tells us they're separated by 200 million years. But they're interbedded. It will not work when we look at the facts and the evidence in the strata. There is abundant evidence that the typical evolutionist's explanation cannot be true. What is the significance of all these layers, this bedded sequence? Many think it takes millions of years to form that, but as the professor that was trying to correct me says, no, the rocks themselves, the beds, we know, were formed rapidly. That's easy to document. Oh, and it's in between the rocks. Really? We notice, for example, a statement by Alan van Jopling, one of the leading authorities in stratigraphy. He has performed very elaborate experiments with experiments at Harvard University, there with the Department of Geological Science. Now, he's reporting in the Journal of Sedimentary Petrology when he says, it is reasonable to postulate a very rapid rate of deposition. That is, a single lamina or layer would probably be deposited in a period of seconds or minutes, rather than in a period of hours. So not only is it not hundreds of thousands of years, but these individual layers are not even hours in duration, but they are deposited in seconds or minutes. Now, what did he say to that? Why did he say that? He said, there is factual evidence from both field observation and experiment that laminae composed of bed material are commonly deposited by current action within a period of seconds or minutes. You go out and you watch it happen. You set up the experiments, the apparatus, and you can reproduce it in the laboratory. This is factual evidence. Repeatable, falsifiable, observable, from field observation experiment and in the laboratory. And so we know we don't have to imagine. We don't have to extrapolate. We see this happen and it takes seconds. Alan Joplin again, Department of Geology, Harvard. We compare other quotations from Dr. Patton's note. This proves instantaneous deposition of the individual beds as postulated by the turbidity current theory. The sandy layers of the flysch did not accumulate gradually, but were cast instantaneously by turbidity currents, each bed in its entire thickness in a matter of hours or less. Another quotation. This is what we know, though it's not taught in very many undergraduate courses. Beds happen rapidly. When we realize the sediment transport principle, we know that a new bedding plane is formed if the current of sediment-bearing water changes direction. If the water changes temperature, if it changes velocity, which can be caused by the texture of the bottom, by the rate of the drop, and so on, there are about 17 factors that have to remain absolutely constant in order to have one homogeneous bed formed. And if you change any of it, and you've got a new bedding plane, then how long can you maintain all of those factors perfectly uniform? Seconds, maybe minutes. And that's what we see illustrated in the fossil record, rapid formation of the rocks, which is obvious to people that will look and will think. Understanding that, one of the more famous evolutionists in the world, Stephen Gould of Harvard, made a very interesting statement about the rocks and their formation. He said, catastrophists, and of course, these are the ones that oppose the uniformitarians, which were the evolutionists, and talking about situations of course, years ago. Catastrophists were the creationists, he said. They were as committed to science as any graduate. In fact, they adopted the more objective that one should believe what one sees and not interpolate missing bits of gradual record into a literal tale of rapid change. It's in between the rocks. A magician would have a better chance of pleasing his audience. Stephen Gould says, now what we actually see is rapidity. But they, quote, no, that this was deposited over billions of years, and so they divided the time into the rocks, and they say, this is at least the average times that was formed. But the actual time is, of course, in between the rocks, because we see indications that they were all formed rapidly. I don't know what you see between rocks. Usually there's nothing. They're interpolating missing bits into a literal tale of rapid change. I think I'd just rather take it literally, just the facts as they are, without imposing the philosophy upon it. It's a belief system. Again, imposing such a philosophy is what's necessary in order to come out old. That's not the literal story. That's the imagined scenario that's imposed on the actual facts. Seconds to millions of years. Oh, wow. One indication of great age is often argued from the formations that we see in caves. We're told that the speleotherms, the stalactites and stalagmites, take thousands of years. The statement in one of the geology textbooks from which I was taught says it takes 100,000 years to form 1 cubic inch stalactites, stalagmites. Really? Now that's an absurd statement, and most geologists know better, but that's what's in some of the textbooks. We have seen these stalactites, drapery formations, and stalagmites form very rapidly. He says he was told by an individual who was a researcher with the National Speleological Society that in Indiana, near Blue Springs at the George Rogers Clark Memorial, in the basement there were formations just like you find in caves. Now this stone that forms this memorial was quarried about just 6 miles from Blue Springs Cave, and the water percolating down through the cracks in the rocks of these limestone blocks has produced formations, just like you find produced when the water percolates down through the cracks in the caves. But there in this memorial building, built by man, we find just exactly what we find in the caves. If you'll notice those drapery-type formations hanging from the fixtures in the basement, we also see the stalactites and the stalagmites that were formed in a building that was at that time less than 40 years old. In fact, these were very large columns of limestone deposition that we found, 11 feet tall. And there were 5 of them, like this, 11 feet tall. Well, if this can form in less than 40 years, I look around, considering that some say that the Earth is supposed to be billions of years old. Where are the huge ones? I mean, the really huge ones. No, it does not take a long time to do this. It's dependent upon the concentration of minerals, the rate of flow, and the ventilation. A number of factors control it, but when the factors are right, they form very, very rapidly. We can summarize the geological phenomenon and the evidence regarding the age of the Earth this way. We look at the fossils, we see their detail. They are polystrate, that is, many strata, up like the trees through many of the layers of strata, proving that these layers could not form slowly. We see merging flow structures interconnected over large expanses that cannot form slowly or gradually. We see the ripple marks in all of the kinds of rocks, all ages of rocks. The most common formation indicate a rapid formation. We see bedded layers, many of them extending for thousands of miles. The Glen Rose limestone begins up in Oklahoma and extends halfway down through Mexico, thousands of miles. And that's not unusual. We're looking at a global phenomena that calls for a global catastrophic phenomena that would deposit huge layers of rock and a catastrophic flood that would do so precisely. We see interbedded periods that are supposed to be 200 million years apart that cannot be. We see this rapid coal and oil form through experimentation. We see the speleotherms that form large structures in just tens of years. The phenomena are all rapid. Whatever you're looking at looks young.